Mm.
Okay, so let's begin. There's a bunch of people now that are starting to show up. So I'm gonna click admit all, and we can begin. I am, of course, very happy to have Ron Chan from the University of Manchester, who's going to present his paper on wildfires, smoky days, and labor supply. So let's just begin. So Ron, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Franishka, for the invitation. I'm very happy to present this paper, and it's a perfect timing as well because I have just got some new results to show you yesterday, today. So that's why it would be some new result at the very end of the presentation. So I'm very excited to see what you guys think. So first of all, this is still pretty much a work in progress. So we welcome any feedback with the paper along the way. So feel free to interrupt me at any point to ask any questions. So this is a joint work with Martino Pelli from University of Sherbrooke and my PhD student, who probably is also in the audience, Veronica Vien. So basically our paper wants to look at the effect of wildfires in Chile. And our ultimate question is trying to understand the effect of air pollution Chile. So I think just to give some context here, because not everybody here might be doing the environment. So there has been quite a lot of evidence that shows that air pollution is showing a very severe impact on different parts of the real economy, right? So let's say Schlenker and Walker in 2016, they showed that the increase in carbon monoxide emissions lead to 540,000 increase in the hospitalization costs. And then Curry and Walker 2011 showed that easy pass, which allow cars to not stop at the toll gates in the US, reduces infant mortality around those houses around the toll gates by more than 10%. Then there's a very cool paper in Ebenstein et al. 2016 in AEJ Applied. Basically, they took some data from the Israeli public exam, and they showed that the exposure to PM 2.5 leads to a lower public exam scores for the students who are doing the exam and places where the PM 2.5 is higher. And then they also track those students down, and then they found there's a lower lifetime earning for those students who are affected. So basically, some evidence that their cognitive ability was being affected. Now, similar to what our paper are doing, we have this Graf-Sivan and Naito paper in AER 2012. They have a bunch of hair pickers in California, and they showed that the increase in ozone concentration would reduce their worker productivity by a significant amount. So our paper focused on a slightly different channel, which is look at the labor supply, which is simply as the number of hours that they worked in a week. All right, so that's our ultimate research, ultimate question. Today is the first time that we can show some result on this because we have been doing the reduced form mostly. So that is the focus for the talk. But we would not be able to answer this question yet, but we're getting there. So one of the problem of studying these kind of questions is that air pollution itself is usually very endogenous, or in some other words, air pollution is not randomly assigned to each individual, right? So you can imagine that when the emissions are high, then you have some avoidance behavior. You might be selected to live in a certain area where air pollution is higher when you're poor, right? So that's why if we just run a regression on air pollution on some of the behavior, it might be endogenous, right? So different people use different techniques to overcome this this problem. So Schlenker and Walker 2016, when they're understanding again morbidity and air pollution, they look at basically houses around the airports in Los Angeles. But obviously the disruption in Los Angeles will also be endogenous. So what they do is that they look at disruption, say in New York or other travel hubs, which stop the airplanes from stopping in LA, so that more air pollution were generated as a result when they were still texting or waiting in the before they take off. So then they use that as an exogenous variation in air pollution. exogenous to LA. Curry and Walker basically just compare households that are near the toll booth and households that are slightly further away, more like a kind of slightly kind of like a regression discontinuity where just like a little bit above, a little bit like next to it, or something like that. And for the Israeli paper, Eberstein et al. 2016, there are basically papers. So what they do is that because the students cannot choose where to do the exam, they were assigned where to do the exam. So then because of this exogenous nature, so they were able to get some exogenous variation in air pollution to look at that. There are quite a number of papers that use the scientific phenomenon called thermal inversion. So in some days, even though air pollution is exactly the same, then there's some days air pollution will be higher, right? So 100 years ago, there's this huge London smog. It's due to thermal inversion that caused many people who die as a result. So our paper, we basically want to just take some exogenous variation in air pollution as exposure to wildfire as an exogenous change to air pollution. So for most of the talk, we'll be focusing on some reduced form estimation to only look at the effect of wildfires. So we'll talk through on how we're going to do that. And we are going to, towards the end of the talk, we have some preliminary results where we're able to show some instrumental variables result where we instrument air pollution with the wildfire measure that we constructed in our paper. All right, so that's basically what the flow of the talk is going to be like today. Yeah, so this is wildfires. So this is perhaps not very surprising to show that wildfire is not just a phenomenon in the US or in Canada, but it's all around the world, right? I think this map actually shows wildfires on a particular day of the year, right? Or on a particular year. So that's why you can see there's quite a lot of fire that happen in the world in a particular year. And if you zoom into a certain country, so this is again, this is Canada. So you can see that there are quite a lot of forest fire that was recorded for the last, say, 30 years or 40 years in Canada, right? So obviously, a lot of countries they care about wildfires. It's been quite common in quite a lot of countries, and they want to look at the effect of the wildfires. And to me, wildfire is also very interesting because wildfire also connects to climate change quite well. So this is a paper in Proceedings to the National Academies of Science in 2016 that basically they analyzed the Western US and then they basically realized that one of the reasons why there's an increase in wildfire activities that happening in the US is because there has been an increase in this so-called field. Climate change basically leads to an increase in field aridity, and that leads to an increase in not just the frequency of the fire, but also the size of the fire. There's more area that were being burned. As you see, these red dots are kind of to the right of these blue dots. As a result, so that's why basically we can also take some of our result, basically saying that if climate change makes wildfire more frequent, what's going to happen to the workers as a result. All right. So in this particular paper, we're actually going to focus on Chile. Chile is, as you see, a very long country here, but Chile also have quite a lot of wildfire activities around basically. So the north of Chile is basically a desert, so there's no like plantation, but then you can see all this. If you look at the graph on the right, this would be the ratio of the area that were burned in the I think this is in the past 50 years or so. All right, so we're going to take these wildfires, these exogenous changes, and we're going to look at how the wildfire affects the workers in our sample. So again, just to quickly recap our research goal. So our research goal here is we want to study the impact of air pollution on working hours in Chile, using this wildfire as an exogenous exogenous variation in air pollution. So our data, as we'll go in about 5 minutes, when we talk about the data a little bit more, Our data allows us to record the actual and usual working hours in a particular week. So what we're doing is that we're using a labor market survey in Chile, which allow us to, one of the questions that we're going to take as a dependent variable from that labor market survey is how many hours did you work last week? All right, so suppose I interview you today and I say, oh, how many hours did you work last week? So that would be the actual working hours that they had last week, but also the usual working hours as well. Basically the contract working hours. So normally, how many hours do you usually work? All right, so by taking a difference, we can basically say that how many hours did they work less or even more compared to the usual working hours. Then what we do is that we are matching the fire exposure to each individual during the week. Now, this matching is not perfect, so we're going to talk about some of the ways that we're going to kind of take that into account. But basically, we have two different fire exposure measures. We're going to show you the first one mostly, which basically using remote sensing data on fire, and then we try to match that to each individual. The labor market survey also gives us a lot of detail about these workers. So we're going to construct a bunch of heterogeneous effects to look at whether air pollution has or wildfires had a different effect on air pollution. I think we have a question in the audience.
Yeah,
hi, Ron. Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Just wanted to ask, are you treating wildfires as exogenous, or is it possible that wildfires or forest fires are also dependent on, say, the income levels and how people are accessing forest resources? So is it, I mean, are you treating them purely exogenous in terms of how much area they cover? Or do you take into account that they can be possibly endogenous as well?
So that's a great question. So at the moment, I'm taking it as totally exogenous. But I take your point that I think there are two possible reasons that this wildfire might not be exogenous, right? One is because it might be agricultural fire, right? So they burn the fire as a result of their economic activities, then it would not be exogenous. So that might be one of the, I mean, there are a lot of papers, I think, looking at China and India about all these agricultural, the straw burning after the agricultural crops. So right now, for the majority of the paper I'm going to show you, we are taking that as exogenous, but because right now we are still remote sensing data. So of course, we can't distinguish whether fire is man-made or whether fire is naturally occurring. So that's why we actually prefer the second measure, which we are still working on, but I'll give you a sense of that because that is based on the forestry department. They gave us a list of fires that were naturally occurring. So then we can single out on the fires that are happening. Yeah, and obviously right now we can only look at this fire as well. So that's the second critique. We are only looking at fire. We can't look at smoke as of now. So, but with the second measure, we're actually allowing some measure of taking into account the smoke as a result of the fire as well. But at the moment, so I would say I like your question, but we can't do that much for the first measure. But we're working on the second measure to take your comments into account.
Got it. Thank you.
There's another question.
Hi, Ron.
Hi, Ridhima.
Hi. So, I didn't see that in the literature you mentioned about, there's this literature by Salvo et al., Zivin and et al. They also see the impact of pollution on worker output, correct? So, right. So, and to a limited extent on worker attendance, right? So, for example, the Salvo et al. Paper, I think is based on workers in China, right? In textile factories in China, where they see the impact of, I think, particulate pollution on worker output, right? So, how does your paper tie in with that literature, right? Ours worked in some sense is, I'm not sure how close it's to output or to work absenteeism, right? So you didn't mention that literature. Where does your paper fit into that literature? Because you see, for a worker, we take pollution as exogenous, right? Right now, where I'm in Delhi, right? I mean, the air is filthy, and I'm just taking it as exogenous. And you understand what I'm asking, right? And we really need the source of exogenous variation. Right? And how does your study fit in with the previous study on the literature, which has looked at the impact of pollution on worker output?
Yeah. That's excellent question, Ridima. Thank you. I think you helped me prepare the slides because it's coming up in 3 slides. I promise. That will talk about the literature about absenteeism, which is very related to what we are doing exactly. So I would defer the question for 5 minutes, and then I would get into that literature for you. So I will have a framework. I think hopefully it's the next slide of linking all the literature together and highlight the contribution of our paper. But our paper basically, in short, our paper tried to focus on the wildfires as an exogenous variation of air pollution. They have a slightly different identification strategy relative to us, but I'll talk about some of these papers in a second. Yeah. All right. As it's coming out with 3 slides, not of 5. Okay, 3 slides. So this is just the framework of us, how we're thinking about how we're going to take what we had and kind of argue the economic impact of air pollution. So that's our focus. So we take a conceptual framework from this working paper by Patrick, Rivers, and Stadler in 2020. So basically what they do is that they model the output of economic output of the economy as being like capital, effective labor output, and pollution, right? That would affect the GDP or affect the economic output. And we can rewrite the effective labor input as a combination of 3 things. So first of all, we have the total number of population N here. And then we multiply that with the worker productivity psi here, as well as the labor that's supplied by each worker here, right? So then effectively, this would be the effective labor input that goes into the production. Right, then we can substitute this formula into the production function that we supply in the first point, and then we get something like this at the bottom, this equation. And we basically also change the hours here, being just the total amount of time that you work minus the number of days that you're sick. So we get into this equation. So we are basically allow pollution to have an effect on 4 different things, right? So you can see that pollution can have an impact on the total number of people, the total population. Pollution can have an effect on the productivity of a worker. Pollution can affect the number of sick days, so the labor supply, which is our focus here, as well as pollution can have a direct impact on output. Right, so that's why if we decompose the total impact of pollution on economic outputs, then we can get into these 4 different things. Of course, the thing in the middle of the bracket are the ones that affect the labor in some sense. So we're going to focus on the literature that looks at that. So the first thing is the air pollution on population, right? So we can also, broadly speaking, imagine that it basically captures the effect of air pollution on health, right? So obviously a number of papers about, we'll also look at mention a few earlier about the infant mortality, right? There are a number of papers that show that air pollution has an effect on respiratory diseases or incidence of respiratory diseases. There's also a kind of interesting paper looking at air pollution might induce people to migrate to different places, right? So these are all things that would affect the population flow. Then the second term here is to look at the effect of pollution on labor productivity. So there's some scientific evidence that show that air pollution can affect cognitive ability on how heart and brain function, right? There's a bunch of scientific paper there, but there's a number of very interesting papers looking at the effect of air pollution on labor productivity, right? So let's say the paper that I really like is the Arch-Smith et al. 2018. That basically what they did is that they take a bunch of umpires in a baseball matches in the American Baseball League, and then they can measure how wrong the umpire gets whether a ball is a good or bad, and then they basically say that if the air pollution is bad on that particular day, will those umpires make more mistake, and they find that this is the case, right? Because the umpires also can't choose where they want to do the matches, right? So that is a nice way to assign exogenous air pollution to places. So in this particular, so in India, there's also a paper looking at like worker productivity in manufacturing facilities as well, and also in China as well. So related to what we're doing, there's air pollution on owls work, right? So there are basically some papers looking at school absenteeism, and also work absenteeism on these papers. So our paper is closely related to those papers. So school absenteeism, so let's say, but I think the identification is slightly different between our paper and their paper. So they are mostly, so let's say Curry et al. 2009 in ReStat. So what they do is that they look at students that are assigned to different schools, and so they use a triple differencing strategy to look at whether air pollution affects whether how many sick days that a student has to call in. Aragon et al. 2017, I think it's looking at forgot which country is Mexico. Also looking at like the number of sick days that they do. So we are looking at the exact working hours that they have, right? So we're able to directly kind of put everything together to look at the economic significance of our work. So our goal is trying to look at the effect of air pollution directly on the owl's work and using wildfires and exogenous variation. And we want to focus on the whole economy rather than just focusing on a particular industry. I think in some of these cases, because they were helping with the identification of air pollution because it was tricky, so they have to only focus on a particular segment of the economy. So let's say going back to this on-pies in MLB or the pear pickers is the very first influential paper by Graf, Stephen, and Naito. So they are focused on a very particular sector. I think I understand why they do it, because they have a very, very good measure on productivity, because they can count the number of pairs they are picking. For the baseball, they can count. They have a very strict measure on whether they made a mistake or not. So for those, then they can measure the productivity very, very well, and then they have to pick some instances where the air pollution it generates exogenous variations. So we're using the wildfire as exogenous variation in air pollution to allow us to look at kind of a direct impact for the entire economy in Chile, so that we can kind of look at the impact of air pollution on the overall economy as our main kind of end goal of our research. Obviously, we haven't got there yet, but that's our focus. So to the best of our knowledge, we think we found one paper that is very close to what we're doing. Is the paper by Boschute, Molitor, and Zhou in 2020. Is a working paper still. So what they do is that they actually look at the effect of air pollution through wildfire smoke for the entire economy in US. So what's the difference between their paper and our paper? Of course, we try to focus on it's like a more developing country context rather than US, but also they are looking at the year-to-year variation wildfire smoke, while we have a weekly variation with short run and medium run. So then, because we believe that wildfire affects a worker in a more short run, will get you sick, like you can't go to work, etc. But you will basically recover after a few weeks. So we try to focus on this short and medium term variation. So our data also allows us to see whether there's a long-term impact as a result, right? So we can see you have exposure to wildfire last week, but you have exposure to wildfire the week before. Does it also generate different impacts for you? So with the weekly variation that we have in our data, we can look at that a little more closely. So you can imagine that our result might be bigger than what they have, because their results are kind of averaged out for the entire year, but we are able to focus on the week that they were affected as a result of the wildfires. All right, so that's the difference between our paper and their paper. They are able to look at other things as well, other than labor supply. They can look at wages and also GDP. I think if I'm not mistaken in their paper. So their paper is slightly more general. Our paper is more focused on the labor supply. And I think because we're able to look at some wildfires as a reduced form at the beginning, and as I tried to argue earlier, that wildfires have been increasing in frequency and severity, right? So it'd be quite interesting only study wildfire as well. And also it would help by understanding how the wildfire affects things. We're able to kind of going back to the kind of wildfire management literature as well. All right, so let me describe a little bit about data, so then you kind of know what assumptions we are making, as well as what kind of data that we have to go into it. All right, so we're going to pull down some labor market data from the Chilean Statistical Bureau from income survey. So they do income survey every month actually every 3 months in a kind of a rolling basis, but only taking that from one of the survey, one of the edition in a year, because that particular one asks more questions, and one of the questions they're going to ask is how many hours you actually work in that week, which is the key dependent variable that we're using in our paper. So we're only taking that particular row, and it's a repeated cross section. So it's not a panel. So every year for those 3 months that we have data, we are going to see what kind of data that they, what kind of hours that they have for each of them, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'll talk about what kind of we observe about where they live and so on in just a minute. And then as I kind of answer a Prachi question earlier, we have 2 wildfire data that we have. For the majority of the talk, we're going to focus on the first one is the modus burn area products. So we have this remote sensing data on fire. I'll describe that in a second. Towards the end of the talk, I'll also show you some very, very preliminary evidence. Just got it fresh from the oven yesterday. We have on each wildfire incident. So we have the duration of the fire, we have the origin of the fire, and also how many areas that the fire has burnt. And then we're going to combine with the wind speed and wind direction to generate a wildfire and smoke measure using the second wildfire source. We also put up some pollution data from the Global Reanalysis database from the EU, which covers the entire world at the 75.75 degree resolution, which is the best we found so far. All right, so a little bit detail about the survey. So again, this is a supplementary income survey that we pulled from the Chilean Statistical Bureau. It's a repeated cross-section that we pulled from 2010 to 2018. So it covers October to December. Now, obviously, it's very cold in here in the UK, but it's still kind of the beginning of the summer. It's the wildfire season. It's the beginning of the wildfire season in Chile. So we're going to see a lot of wildfires around that period. The survey itself did not actually contain much information about just a month of the survey, but we're able to contact the Chilean Statistical Bureau to obtain the exact date of the interview that's taken place. So we then, with the exact date, we're able to match to see which week they were talking about when they said that I worked less that particular week. Okay. In each year, we survey roughly 11,000 households, which basically about 20,000 individuals, a little bit more than 20,000 individuals every year in our data set as well. So our survey contains, of course, a lot of labor market information, like what kind of work that you have, your demographics, gender, age, education, where you live, and where you work at the communal level. I'll show you a map later to describe what communal level is. So comuna, so in Chile we have about 365 comunas. So that is what we observe to be where they live and work, and also the characteristics of their work, right? So what is their usual hours of work, how many hours they actually worked, and the types of industry and occupation that they're in as well. So we are going to use a lot of the information that we observe in the survey, as I said, to break down our measure into find some heterogeneous impacts of that.
So Ron, just a minute before I forget about this. Is the impact of wildfires on labor supply operating through increased pollution, or is it something else? That's not been clear.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kanishka. Thank you. So when we first started the project, we thought that being air pollution would be the main channel in which the wildfires affecting labor. But you can imagine that wildfire could also have a different impact on individuals, right? So one of the way that you can think of is that, oh, wildfire shut down all the roads, so I can't go to work, or I prefer to stay at home. Oh my God, there's a fire, there's a village burning next to me, so I'd rather stay at home. So then, yeah, it would invalidate the instrument because it means wildfire has a direct impact on the labor market. So the way that we do, so for majority of the talk, we are showing the reduced form evidence on how labor affects. So I think we are approaching it two different ways. The first way that we're going to show is in the labor market survey, they also ask, why are you working less this week? So they have to give a reason. It's a categorical reason. They have like, oh, because my work is flexible, or because I have to take care of a kid, or because my health reason, because of natural disaster, etc., etc. So we are able to take some of these to see whether these people who work less, what is the reason that they gave, right? So to concentrate on the fact that whether it's through air pollution. And just to jump to the conclusion right away, we found that the effect are very strong if we isolate people who answer health as a reason that they work less. So we have confidence that it's actually through air pollution that wildfire is affecting them. Secondly, I think what we're trying to construct now using the new data set is that we're trying to construct the smoke. We're going to try to isolate the effect of smoke and fire, because some comments that we got before also is that fire might also have a direct impact on the labor demand, right? So maybe shut down the factory, so you don't have to go down, you have to go into work, so that it's not exactly where supply, but even the labor demand. So what we're trying to do is that we're trying to construct just the smoke, isolating the fire, so that the smoke would be affecting the air pollution more directly, rather than through affecting, say, roads, affecting let's say, and everything as well. We also have the intensity of the fire, so we're able to kind of isolate. Maybe we can ignore the very, very huge fire that may be shutting down all the roads and so on. So we're able to do a little bit more diagnostic to focus on the fire that really affect through air pollution. Yeah. So that would be we're not there yet, but that's the way that we are approaching it.
Okay, so there's also a question on whether this income survey is is selected because it's based on your employed households. So I suppose, do you take that into account? I suppose.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. I believe that the survey is representative at the province level. So it's not, it's representative to, we can check, we can double check on this, but I believe that is representative for the Chile, not just representative for the employed households. Yeah, it's sampled based on the population, not based on the employment. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Sorry if I'm jumping the gun here, and you might be addressing this later. Do you observe attrition in your sample? Like going from one panel, going from like one cross section to another?
We have roughly the same number of households every year. So obviously they are different households because they are repeated cross sections. So we don't, in terms of the number, we actually have a robustness check at the end, basically. But I think it's addressing a slightly different issue that you have. But basically, we don't. We have not compare. What we can do is that we can compare the sample across different years to see whether they're comparable. I don't think we have done this check yet, but we can double check. But in terms of the number of households, is very stable over time.
Got it. So one of the papers that you listed, which was Aragon paper from GEAM in 2017, I believe, they actually do mention this, that there is this selection because of attrition. And they do, and they're like you, they're also using like a panel data. So they devise like, some method by which they can empirically test whether that's going to affect their results. So the only concern is, as you said, avoidance behavior or even attrition due to selection. I mean, which shows that you are selectively going off from the panel data because you are, say, moving, because you're more richer or you're more educated. So
But
Perhaps.
our is not a panel. It's just a repeated cross section. So every year we sample different households. So we're not using the we're not using the year
Got
to
it.
year.
If
So
that's the case, then then I think what you are doing makes more sense then, that you are comparing the characteristics, whether characteristics are same over time.
We did a test at the end, and I may have not had time to go through that, but we did a test to see whether the same number of households were because more wildfires occur in December versus October. So we want to see whether we sample different households, say in October versus November versus December. But it's they did a very good job, surprisingly, that the characteristics among different months are fairly similar.
Got it. Thank you.
So Ron,
may I ask you a question, please? Sorry, go ahead.
So just a very quick clarificatory question. So going back to the question I'd earlier asked, I think then, so you are in this paper interested in seeing what's the impact of the exogenous increase in the pollution level due to the wildfires, and just not seeing the impact of, say, pollution on worker hours worked. Do you understand the difference between the two? In one setting, I'm just interested in seeing the impact of, say, pollution on hours worked, as opposed to an increase in pollution due to wildfires, right? I think that's the question Kanishka asked you, and I wasn't very sure, what exactly you were trying to tell him, because I'm not able to understand why do you need this exogenous change in PM. I think you would need.
I'll show you in a second. Basically, it's to address the reverse causality of air pollution on labor hours, because you can think of a case where if you work more, right, then it generates more pollution in your factory, right? Because if you work, so suppose there's an exogenous productivity shock, right? That your firm works more. Your firm asks you to come in because we're very productive today, and you work more, and then you generate more pollution. So then, if we just run the OLS regression, I'll show you in a second that if you just run the OLS regression,
I'll wait for you to show it to me. Thank you.
But sorry, Juan.
Yes. No, I was wondering if you check in this data set if it's really representative at the communal level, because at least the employment survey is representative, but at the strata level. You can identify the comuna, but the data set is representative at the strata level. I think it's something probably to take.
That's a good question. Yeah, very good question. We are not, this survey is not representative at the communal level. It's representative of the province level, from what I understand. So province will be one level larger. I think we have about 100 provinces, so a little bit less than 100 provinces in Chile.
150, 160. Yeah.
Right.
The other comment is that because this is a very windy part of the world, all Chile and the Patagonia, one question that some people might ask you is there an effect of the wind on the pollution, because it's always moving from the west to the east, so it will depend where you have, I don't know, the fire that will affect if you are to the
So again, excellent question.
Impact.
Definitely. So
it's something just that to take into account.
So you'll be disappointed for the first 30 minutes because I'm going to show you not taking into account the wind, but we have been working lately, last couple of weeks, trying to take into account this. So right now we have wind direction and wind speed data that we pulled together. So we're able to look at how the fire spreads on that particular day. So we have the wind on that particular day and speed. So we're able to construct the smoke that as a result of fire, as a result of that wind. And so we take into account both the direction and speed to create more exogenous variation as a result. But thank you for we are working on that. Thank you. As I said, I'm going to disappoint Juan because I'm going to basically show you how we're going to measure this exposure of fire. So this is the remote sensing data that we got from MODIS. As you can see, some red dot that we put a circle there. So those are the fire on that particular day that happened. I forgot which day this is already. But basically, it's each raster cells it's 500 meter by 500 meters. So we will see that, okay, there's some fire that's going on in those cells, all right? And then what we're going to do is to match the fire to the household. Now, so we're going to now describe us how we're going to do that. Now, so you can see here, this is, I believe, also around Santiago. So you can see each cell or each polygon that you see on the slide, each communa. So we only know which communa they live in. All right. So obviously we don't know the exact coordinates or where they live in. We actually try to get more detailed information from the Chilean government, but they are not able to share this, obviously, because of confidential reason. So we only know which communa they live in. So what we do first is that we constructed a so-called population-weighted centroids. So there's some more data that we get is the manzana, which is within the communa with manzanas. So we have the census level data we pulled from 2017 or 2017 on the population on each communa. So then we're able to construct a weighted average of these different centroids. So we take a centroid from each communa, and then we do a population weighted average. And then this would be the blue star that you see on the map. So this blue star captures more or less where they are at, right? So we are moving, so you can see that they are not the same as the geometric centroid. So basically, we are now assuming that people are living around the population weighted centroids. So then we basically, what we do is that then we draw a circle around these population weighted centroids to basically measure how to count the number of fires around the centroid. So this green circle that you saw here, right? So then we can, of course, we can control the size of this circle. So there is a trade-off between how big we want this circle to go. We can be very tiny, right? Very tiny means that, but the very tiny means that it might be affecting, the fire might be happening somewhere around the outside of the circle. But if you take a circle that is too big, you might be capturing things that are maybe not really burning, and so on. So there is a trade-off here between how big the circle. We test how big this is. It's quite robust on changing the size of this. Our preferred specification is a 2-kilometer buffer, right? So this is what we drew here. So it basically just count the share of the cells. So there are, let's say, 100 cells that are enveloped by this circle, and they'll just count the number of cells that are enveloped by the circle, and then we construct a measure as a result of this. Now, obviously, the question you might ask is that there's a lot of measurement error as a result of this, right? Because obviously, what if you have two population centers in this communa, right? So then the population weighted central will be somewhere in the middle of the two, which means that you're really not capturing anything. So we'll construct a way to take that into account. But let me first show you some descriptive statistics on the labor market and also on the measure, and then I'll jump right to how we handle that measurement error. Yeah, this is just a kind of a quick thing about this measure. So we can look at the actual working hours that they have, as well as the usual working hours that they have. And then you can see that from the data, we see that most people work less, or on average, people work less compared to their usual working hours. And then we also observe whether they work outdoor and indoor. So compared to the literature, what we do is that the outdoor, it's a direct. So in the labor market survey, they asked the question, last week, did you actually work outdoor or indoor? So we are not matching based on the occupation. We actually observe directly, or they tell us whether they work outdoor or indoor. So we're going to use that to look at some heterogeneous impact at the end. And we don't see such a huge difference of the two. So then we're also able to pull some precipitations and temperature data from a research center in Chile. And we're going to basically look at the share of wildfire. Obviously, wildfire is not a common thing, so that's why we have very low mean. If you look at the share of wildfires that are positive, then we're able to see that roughly it burns about 22% of the circle that we drew earlier, right? So meaning that an average. So we defined an average wildfire incident as being 22% of that buffer that we showed you earlier. It's covered in fire. All right. So that's the thing we're going to use as a when we try to make sense of what the coefficient means. We're going to use the average working hours that we saw here, as well as the share of the wildfire that's burned in this buffer to construct this measure. So if you see that when the area is getting bigger, obviously the share is now smaller because the circle is bigger, right? So we can see that it's kind of a trade-off here that we have. And these are the number of. Yeah. Sorry.
If you can go back to the previous slide. Sorry if I missed this detail before. But the radius that you're using for the buffer is around 2 or 3 kilometer maximum.
Yeah. We also go up to 10, I think, or go up to 10 kilometers.
But I mean, a lot of the papers in the literature actually use larger radius purely because the transport of pollutants, say from the source, which is wildfire in this case, can actually travel longer distances. So in the literature, people have used 50 kilometers, 75 kilometers. Even in my paper, I look at 75 kilometers. And I get why you are using like a smaller radius because you don't want to expand it too much, but it might be too small as well at this point of time.
Yeah, very good question, because that is the reason why at the end of the day, we have this, I'll show you some nice reduced form evidence, but then as you correctly predicted, our variation are too small, turns out, because we restricted the cell to be very small. So that's why we actually now working on a second exposure measure that would be able to take into account how far the pollutant has been traveling with the wind speed data, with the origin of the fire, with duration of the fire, and the direction of the wind. So we'll be able to construct like a plume in this context, yeah, to answer. So hopefully in a couple of months, this will be perfectly addressed. Yeah, but not now, unfortunately. Yeah. But perfectly fine question. Yeah, we completely understand the problem of this very small circle. Yeah, so this would be the descriptive, the household controls that we have in our data. So we control for household size, control for years of education, we control for the age of the, I think this is the head of the household. And also, we also to see whether the the age, individual level age, and then we also could to see whether that particular household is the main breadwinner of the household, whether they're married, and whether they are male or female in the data. All right, so this is our empirical specification. Again, this is just a reduced form that I'm showing you for the majority of the day today. So of course, we have the reported number of hours for that particular individual. Right, so that household lives in a particular region, province, commune, and working in that particular household. And then we have during the particular week T, right? Of course, T is judging by year, month, at that particular week. All right. So then we basically control for the buffer share, again, how many of that circle around the populated weighted centroid is burned, right, as our main explanatory variable during that particular week that they were working. And then we control for a bunch of household characteristics, such as education level, size of the household, etc. And then we control for a bunch of fixed effects here, right? So we control for the province fixed effect to take into account that is representative of the communal province level. We can also technically do communal level, but then we're stretching the identification a bit too much here because we don't actually observe a panel, the communal. We control for month fixed effects to see that maybe the working hours is different depending on season of the year. We control for industry year fixed effect to control for the fact that maybe working hours are different depending on which industry you're working on, and also allow that to change over time. Same thing for region year fixed effect. We also allow that maybe in a particular region, the labor market is different. So that's why the working hours also changes over time as well. Right? So we take those into account. Yeah, so our main identification is mainly coming from the fact that we are comparing households that are living within the same province, but they have different across different years with the different kind of buffer share that we see there.
So to follow up on Prati's question, the fact that you have this sort of small radius, right? doesn't that mean that your beta is going to be a sort of lower bound on the true effect?
So say that again, the last bit, sorry.
Doesn't this mean if the buffer zone is too small, right? Then your estimated beta is going to basically be a lower bound of what might be the true effect, because you're not accounting for all the possible downwind effects, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so we have basically a higher measurement error, right? So yeah, it's a attenuation bias as a result. Yeah. So I think that's fair to say. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier about the way that we construct this buffer. So what we do is to account for some of the measurement error, we actually try to imagine how much we are taking into account the fire, because so this is all about the measurement error in terms of fire. So this is just taking one particular comuna in Chile around Santiago. So this is you can see that within a comuna we have these manzanas, right? And we have the population of the manzana from the census data. And then this is the green circle covers this the buffer that we generated around the population centroid. And what we do is that basically if you have people who are living outside of the centroid, right, then we might not be correctly assigning whether they have a fire next to them or not. Right, so that's why we have this measurement error as a result of not assigning fire properly. So then, so we basically weight our regression based on using this weight. The weight is basically counting the number of people living within this green circle versus the people outside of the green circle. So you can imagine if all of them are living inside the green circle, then it means that we have a high confidence that we are assigning the fire correctly. Versus if they are very far away, then it might be wrong. So we do a robust check at the end by dropping some of these sample with a very low weight that we are not very confident that we are assigning fire correctly. Now I have to say that here we are not really addressing what Prachi was saying, because there's smoke, right? That as a result of the fire, obviously we're not taking that into account right now. Hopefully at the end, if I have time, I'll leave some time at the end to show you some results also. All right, so let's get on to the results. So this is our baseline result with the 2 kilometer buffer, the size of that circle. So we show that they're negative, right? So basically the highest share of the wildfire that's being burned in that area, then you work less. Right, so taking into account the average working hours, as well as the average wildfire that's being burned, that buffer, we showed that it reduces the labor supply by 2.3%, which roughly 1 to 2 hours from our sample. So we control for a bunch of different controls, right? So we have some, say, our preferred specification is the last one, where we control for the weather. We control for all the fixed effects that I showed you. We also control for the household controls, like the age, gender, etc., in our sample. So we also showed that it doesn't really matter so much about where or the size of that. Obviously, if it's very small, then the variation even smaller. But then we found that even though it sounds the effect is bigger, but because the average wildfire share is actually smaller in that area, so then the effects at the end, the percentage impact of wildfire on labor supply is roughly the same if we stretch the buffer size a little bit bigger. And then we also show that this is our preferred specification, where we control for all the fixed effects as well as all the household controls.
Ron, I might have missed this, but what level are you clustering the standard errors here? Because the shock in some sense is aggregate shock, right?
Right. That's an excellent question. I should have a solution right away. I think we cluster at the I'll try to find the answer while I present. Sorry about that. Actually, I should have the question here. I think we cluster at the communal level, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, so we did cluster that. We did cluster an error, but I forgot the which area that we clustered that. Sorry. It's been a while running these regressions. But I'll answer that at the end once I'm able to find that. Sorry about that. Yeah. Oh, my student is finding it right now for me. So I'll answer that, Nikita. Sorry, I'll get back to you. And so what we did is that, so of course we're relying on this random assignment of fire or the working hours. So one way to check whether we are assigning these wildfires correctly is that we can replace our dependent variable using the usual working hours, the contract working hours. Because if this is not a random assignment, then we will basically see that this being statistically significant, right? That the share of wildfires would be correlated with the usual working hours. And so it's kind of nice that we show that it's kind of more like a zero effect here. Okay. So we also look at the lag effect to see whether people have a rebound after the fire. So we can see that we can control for the blue one is the one that I showed you, but the red one is the one that we also control for the lag fire share in that commune. So basically, we control for whether there's fire burning in the week that you work, also whether there's fire burn the week before you go to work that particular week. So we are able to to show that. And to answer the question, yes, it's cut at the commune level. So we just checked. Okay, so what else? Yeah, so then we basically found that the labor market they burn a little bit. Sorry, they work a little bit more the week after the fire settled down. As a small rebound effect afterwards, but the net effect is still negative and statistically significantly different from zero. Yeah, so if we take into account the rebound, the effect will be slightly smaller, 1.76% rather than 2.3%. Okay, so then we start looking at, let's see, time, I have about 20 minutes left. So we take into account a bunch of heterogeneous impacts. So we first look at the impact by reason. So as I said in the survey, they have to give a reason why they work less or work more. Right. So if they answer a different number with the usual and the real working hours, and they have a categorical, they can choose what kind of reason that they give. And also gender, right? Do we find different impact between women and men, and indoors and outdoors, right? Or of course, we expect the outdoor workers to have a larger impact than the indoor workers. Do we find different impact depending on the income level, industry, and occupations? So the first thing we look at the impact of by any reason. So we're looking at the usual versus real. Like we can think about this as the absenteeism, the number of sick days that they have. So what we found is that if they cite health reason as one of the main reasons why they isolate those cases where those two are different, and then we look at whether they are reporting any other reasons versus just the health reason. And then we find that the people who reporting health reason, the wildfire has a stronger impact on their number of sick days. So we think that this is some indirect evidence at the very least that the wildfire is affecting the people through health reason. Through pollution rather than through, say, road closure or some direct impact of wildfire on the working hours. That's our interpretation of this coefficient. So we find this is much bigger. So then we start looking at the air pollution by gender. So we think it's kind of interesting at the beginning why we might expect the air pollution to be different by gender. So the first reason is that women have childcare responsibility. So if I get sick, I don't go to work. But if my children get sick, then it's also very more likely for them to not go to work to take care of the kids. Or women can have a different physiological impact from air pollution. So we actually find some biology or medicine paper that show that women actually found that are more susceptible to lung disease induced by air pollution, and also more adverse impacts. So they have a high incidence of getting a disease, but also a worse impact if that happens relative to men. So then we think that, okay, that might be quite interesting to look at. So then what we did is the following. So we split our sample based on whether they're women or men. So we showed that women have a much stronger impact relative to men, as you see that from the top panel versus the bottom panel. To answer the question whether it's between a childcare responsibility or whether or not, sorry, the physiological impacts, then we basically also split our sample whether they have kids or whether they don't have kids in the household. And then we don't find such a huge difference between with kids and without kids. We also look at whether they have access to nursery or not, right? Because they can send their kids somewhere else. We also couldn't find any impact between that. Interestingly, we found that men with kids have a stronger impact than men without kids. So it's kind of, from concluding from this slide, we believe that women have a stronger impact from air pollution, impact of air pollution, maybe because of the second reason rather than the first reason.
Ron, this can also be because of the difference in occupation structure across gender, right? So
yeah.
Do you see any differences in the outdoor participation of men and women?
Yeah, so this is the next slide. So we found the outdoor is bigger. I think we are trying to look into that because of the fact that our measurement is not too many variations, so we can't split our sample by too much. But we do control for industry fixed effect here, to control for the fact that they might be a little bit different. So we can see with the new measure, we can see we can break down by occupation and gender to see whether we can see within each occupation or within each industry, we also see this gender disparity on our impact. Prachi, do you have a question?
Right, I do.
As well?
Is this result slightly counterintuitive that women without kids are the ones who have a higher, their magnitude size is higher as a reaction to wildfire? Or maybe perhaps you can put all of these together by using an interaction sort of specification and test. It will probably tell you. It looks larger here, but it may not be statistically larger. And
I think
might pop out in someone's eyes, but that may not.
Yeah, I think we have not tested. I think we just got this 3 days ago. So for the talk, we have generated a lot of new results for the talk. But yeah, very good point. I don't think it looks like they're not statistically significant, but of course we should formally test that to show that. Yeah, but very good point. Thank you. So yeah, as I briefly showed that when Nikita asked the question, we also showed that the outdoor workers have a stronger impact. I think we put everything together. The outdoor workers will experience about 3.7% reduction in working hours versus 2.3% for indoor workers. Juan? I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah. I was wondering if it's possible to check in the data set if workers migrate to work, because reviewing that data set in Chile, what I found that there is a lot of labor migration, particularly due to the mining sector. So where they live is not where they work. So the effects that you might get, particularly about labor there, might be different.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, there's something that I would going to remind my cohort to check. Yeah, we do have where they work as well. I think what we did is that we replaced the share of wildfire to where they work, and we find similar effects if we replace that to where they work rather than where they live. But what we're going to do, but we haven't done yet, is look at the commuters specifically to see whether the commuters have a different impact. So all we do is, of course, they might still all be commuters, but at least we can see which community they work in, which community they live. If they're different, we define them as commuter. But we haven't checked whether they have a different impact yet.
Yeah. Well, okay. Thank you.
So we also they were break down by industries. So I'm just showing you two here. We found that agricultural workers have a much stronger impact on as we might expect, right? Because they would be mostly working outdoors relative to some other sectors. And then we also found that the unskilled workers, we also break down by occupations. The unskilled workers are the ones that also have a much stronger impact. And then we're also able to break down by outdoor because we have enough unskilled workers in our samples. We're able to break down into, say, by outdoor versus indoor. And then we found that it's slightly bigger, the impact for the outdoor. But I think I tested the two. They're statistically different from one another. So we found that the wildfire on unskilled workers who work outdoor are the strongest. That's what we found. So we're able to get we don't have the measure of the income, but we have the income bracket. So we have the income basically the poorest, the median, the richest households. And then we found that the impacts are the strongest, not in the poorest, but turns out to be the people in the middle. I think the definition here, the poorest are the ones that earn below the national income. The median is between 1 and 2 national income or median income, minimum income. So I think the poorest are probably, maybe we capture some of these, maybe they work part-time and so on. And maybe they are less elastic in the labor supply, whereas the one in the middle have the strongest impacts that we found. Okay, how much time I have? 10 minutes. All right, so I would probably not show you too much of these robustness checks here. But basically what we do is that we show that if we randomize, we do a placebo test on the occurrence of wildfire, for example, the results still change, still pretty much the same, and we eliminate the region with low incidence of wildfire, that still is the same, and then we also eliminate communers with the low weights that we saw. The low weight is the ones that we cannot confidently assign the fire to the communal, and the results are still very robust. So then with 10 minutes left, let me show you some very new results. So as I said, we're trying to construct a second measure now on the wildfire. So basically what we did is that we have the fire level data from CONAF, which is a National Forest Corporation in Chile. So we have the origin and size of the fire. So the hectares of burn, they have quite a lot of information. They even tell us like what kind of trees that was burned as a result, right? But we have not been intelligent enough to use the information yet to construct a measure. So we have the wind speed and wind direction from the origin. So you can see that from that particular picture that I drew here, we have the orange sign, which is the size of the fire. So we basically draw a circle around based on the origin, and that's the fire based on the number of hectares that they reported to be burned here. And then from the origin, with the wind speed and wind direction, we're able to generate a smoke plume. I think we're going to test quite a number of different ones. Our first trial, our smoke plume are very small, so we kind of the same problem as before. We don't have enough variation, so we're confident that we're going to basically play around with how we generate smoke plume using wind speed and wind direction so that we create more variation as a result. Right now, it's very tiny, the one that we generated. Then we calculate the share of this manzana that's covered by this fire or smoke, so we can kind of tease out the labor demand if you include the fire versus the smoke. So we don't have enough variation now, but we're able to show some kind of interesting results so far with the one that our smoke plume are very short, because as Pachi said, it can go up to a number of kilometers. I think right now it just go up to 1 or maybe even less kilometers. So we have not been able to construct our favorite measure yet. So if we control for that variable, so we after we calculate the share of the manzana that's covered by the smoke or the fire, we then collapse back to a weighted average on the communer. So that would be the kind of a probability that you are impacted by the smoke within your communer. So then we also show that negatively and statistically significant measures. So it means that if you are covered in the smoke or covered in the fire, then your real working hours would also be a bit lower. And I think roughly speaking, this also brings up to about 2 or 3%. So it's kind of comparable to what we had before. Obviously, the variation is a bit weak because we have not been able to kind of construct. There's still a lot of measurement error because we are not able to construct such a kind of a high, kind of a large or long enough smoke plume yet. So this is what happened to answer Ridima's question. This is what happened if you just run OAS regression. So we pulled this PM2.5 data from the remote sensing data, we analyzed data. So we matched that with the communer. And then we basically found that if you just run a regression, we found that PM2.5 makes them work more, right? So this is the reverse causality impact, right? If you work more, then it generates more pollution, more air pollution. So we found a very highly statistically significant impact on the effect of air pollution on working hours, which is, we think is wrong, right? Because it's not, we shouldn't. And then we try to instrument that with our—
Ron, just one second there. Whether if you work more and that generates more pollution to an extent depends on the type of work you do, right? So do you have some reason to believe that there's reverse causality? You get my point? That these
We control for industry year fixed effect. So we control for like whether some particular industry is generating more pollution than the other.
So then after controlling for that also there's reverse causality?
Yeah. So all the way from 1 to 5, yeah. So we control for, we also allow the industry to be more productive over time and so on, but it's the same result. Juan, do you have a question? No, okay. All right, so so then we try to instrument that with our instrumental variable that we constructed 2 slides ago. This one, it's not that kind of plume, it's a very tiny plume. So we are still working on constructing a better smoke plume as a result of that, but we're able to kind of reverse the sign. It's still almost statistically significant. It's like 0.12, 0.11, but we are kind of confident that if we do a little bit better job in constructing a smoke plume, we're able to kind of do that. So we have some preliminary evidence that show that once we kind of once we instrument the PM2.5 using the smoke plume that we constructed, then we are able to kind of reverse. So we already reversed the sign, right? It's positive statistical significant. It's a very strong impact. Actually, the first stage was very strong. So it's not so much to do with the measure, due to the weak instrument. Of course, we have to formally test it for yet, but then we have some, because yesterday we were thinking whether we should show this or not, because obviously it's not the best result yet, but I thought it's a nice, it's an encouraging sign that our instrument is going the right direction. Of course, we have not been able to create the right thing yet, but at least we're able to show that the PM2.5 generates fewer working hours for the people in our sample.
Edron, just one question. You were aggregating everything at the commune level, is it?
Communal level, yes.
Right. Then, I mean.
No, sorry. We have not. So this is still at the household level. Sorry, at the individual level. So we are just assigning the communal, or you're just assigning the PM2.5.
So the exposure is.
It's at the communal level.
Right. So then why don't we have fixed effects for communal level?
I think because we are trying to, we also tried the one with the communal level before this, using the previous one. The results are still similar, but it's just much weaker. I mean, in terms of the statistical significance, it's much weaker. I think we believe that because we don't actually have enough like variations over time, because if you put communal, then basically it's the only thing that you're relying on is the comparing whether this communal is burned or that communal is burned over time. So we don't have province level, so it's slightly bigger than communal. We have about 100 and something provinces. So at least we're comparing within that provinces. So we kind of do but we cluster it at the communal level to kind of get a sense of that. So hopefully when we have a better measure, we can try the fixed effect of the communal to see if that it doesn't change the result, it just reduces the significance statistically by quite a bit. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. That's it for the day. I think I write with the time here. So just to conclude, in this paper, we are studying the impact of air pollution on labor supply using wildfires. So only until today, that I was only able to show you some reduced form evidence of wildfires on labor supply. So we basically identify our result using the random assignment of interview dates and also the random nature of this wildfire occurrence. And then we basically show that on average, if a household is exposed to an average wildfire, in our sample, then it would reduce their working hours by about 1 hour a week, or about 2.3% of their labor supply. And we find the effects are larger for people who work on like primary industry occupation, people who work outdoor, and also people who are women have experienced a much stronger impact of air pollution or wildfires. And then very, very preliminary evidence suggests that at least we show very preliminary that PM2.5 does reduce working hours after we instrument using our wildfire measure. And that's it for today. To see if anyone has more questions.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, so we have about 5-10 minutes for additional questions because we've had quite a few. I actually had one, and I was waiting to see if it would be answered, but I didn't quite get it. So one thing that I think it would be, I don't know how you do this, but one thing that could be relevant to seeing if this is really pollution versus, let's say, a temporary shock to your demand for work, and so that's why you're seeing this result. You need to separate it out to, in some sense, whether the reduction in labor supply is happening because people are just falling sicker or whatever, or is it happening because of this sort of temporary shock. And my sense is that that's going to be hard to do, but the one thing to do is you'll have to give up on sample size, but you could look at, the problem is you don't have a panel, so that's going to be hard to do. But one thing that you could do is you could look at, I'm just trying to think out loud here, you could look at areas that are maybe more exposed to high pollution, compare them to less, just to get some kind of handle on whether it's really high pollution that's causing this versus not. But when I say that out, that sound very convincing to me. But the idea is that are these wildfires having this effect on labor supply because they are just making you sicker and therefore you are getting less efficient, or are they making you I think, and the difference really here is between the short and the long run. If you are the short run effects will be not picking up, I think, the real problems which will be coming from these long run health impacts. And so there might be ways to construct a sort of long run. So, historically, this has been a high polluted area. Do we get a stronger result here? It won't really answer this question, but it will maybe help because I think that's important to, because this long and short run thing is quite important to figure out where this is coming from. And I thought your data was not particularly long, but it looks like you've got about 8 years, right?
Yeah, 9 years, I think. Yeah.
9 years.
We can see if we can get more.
That's borderline long. You
Not 10 yet. The 10 would be long, maybe. Yeah.
So that I think would be actually something to think about. Because I think all the evidence is basically saying that all this stuff from air pollution, it's long run accumulation that it affects things. It's not short run. There's you're going to find, in some sense, you're not going to find much, right? And so your results are going to be sort of driven to zero because you're looking for small effects.
I was partly smiling because that's kind of like a research proposal that I submitted, but it got turned down like last year about COVID, because we also interested in looking at short run, long run impact of air pollution. But yeah, it's we can try to see how much of the data we can stretch to answer your question. But I think our preferred way to address this labor demand question, every time when we present a paper to a labor economist, that's the question that they're going to throw at us about, but it's a labor supply or labor demand. So the way that we are thinking of doing it, I'm interested to hear what you guys think, is to look at smoke rather than fire, because I think fire would have a more direct impact on the labor demand. So the way that we think about that is we take into account both the fire and smoke. Then we'll look at both the effect of labor supply and labor demand, because the fire would also affect the firm, the production firm itself. But then if you look at the smoke, maybe it's only affecting the worker, but not so much to do with the firm. So that's our preferred way to split up whether it's to do with the labor supply or with the supply of the labor demand. So that would be our what we are currently thinking about. Of course, right, over what I presented, I haven't been able to done it yet. But if we're able to generate a smoke plume and the fire, then maybe we can do something about that.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I have 2 points to make to what Kanishka said and to what you replied. As Kanishka was saying that, perhaps you can look at health impacts. A lot of the papers, what they have done is that they look at short-term health impacts by using, say, DHS surveys, and they show that there is more cough because of these wildfires, but it doesn't have an impact on, say, fever or diarrhea, which are not supposed to be impacted by pollution. So there you have it, that you are able to show that in short term there is increased amount of asthma or coughing, and that sort of solidifies your story that it's indeed labor demand story, labor supply story, because my own health is getting affected in short term. So it's truly a short term effect. Second thing that I was going to say, which I'm now completely blanking out on, but it will probably come back to me. You carry on, and then I'll probably try and remember it.
You say you want to comment on the reply as well, my reply about the smoke plume. And
I'm now forgetting what your reply was. Like in just 2 or 3 words, what you said, it will probably come back to me.
Okay.
Right, now I remember, sorry. You said that you want to control for the fact that, whether it's labor supply or labor demand. So when you are looking at fires, you can divide them into, sort of fires which are blowing towards you, but also other fires which are generally there in the area, which sort of capture the general economic activity level in the area. So that covers sort of, the labor demand part. And the one that is directly flowing towards the households is the one that captures the labor supply part. So that was my comment, that when you do this plume thing, you can use, your variable, which is, related to all the households which are lying in the plume, and what's the share of, area borne. That is related to truly labor supply part. But the other sort of angles related to origin of a pollution, which is, say, the opposite, opposite to the main plume, or even the other, sort of angles or arcs which are there, they sort of capture the general economic activity. So they can potentially capture the labor demand part.
I see.
You control
Okay.
for both. And when you find the effect on just the plume variable, or this sort of upwind sort of fires, then that's probably supporting your labor supply story.
Yeah, so that's our ways to just single out the labor supply. We only want to look at the smoke, the plume, and ignore everything else, because that would be solely about labor supply, as you said.
Right, but you control for it nonetheless, so that you are sort of taking into account another channel which can also give you the same results. So we control for it, although your focus remains on this.
Yeah, so right now, what I show you today, I didn't do that, but what we plan to do is just to cut off the point where it's close to fire and just look at the smoke and see what's the impacts. Yeah, so that's,
So Ron, I'm audible, right?
Yes.
So, just to get a sense of, why in the papers by Zivin and et al. And others, of course, there's an emphasis, and their findings are that, as pollution increases, worker output decreases, correct? But the recent paper by Salvo et al. In China actually finds a very, very small impact of pollution on worker output. Right, and they only find that impact, to the best of my knowledge, after they take into account lagged effect of pollution on output. Right, so concurrent impact they find none. Right, and also, what's the mechanism here, right? So papers that look at the impact of temperature, say, on worker output or worker attendance, the mechanism is clearly understood, right? Basically, if you feel hot, you'll work less, right? And we all get it, right? Whereas for pollution, the mechanism is also not really understood, right? So in your study, for example, at least what I remember, and please to correct me if I'm wrong, that you found limited evidence of pollution, in increase in pollution on worker output, right? So so what I'm trying to tell you is that though there is a literature that finds a negative impact, there is also an emerging literature that doesn't find a strong impact, right? The magnitude is small, and only after you take into account lagged pollution, right? And and even from epidemiology, the mechanism is not clear how changes in PM 2.5 or changes in air pollution would impact the health of relatively relatively fit individuals, right? I could be coughing because I did not wear say warm clothes and or I ate something. You understand what I'm trying to say here? So something about the mechanism and how they tie in with your findings, right?
Yeah, but I think right now, of course, we are single. Of course, I'm showing you a reduced form earlier about wildfire. Of course, it's very, very silent on the mechanism on how wildfires are affecting the workers. So yeah, I think if we can find some, say, direct evidence, say asthma or incidents and so on, there would be a bit more direct impact of those in. Of course, there's some papers on science and all that that shows that it does affect the health, right, on the PM at least, right. So of course, a number of other things as well. So yeah, I think we are, maybe I have not been kept too up to date with the literature, to be honest. So yeah, I think we will take a closer look on what the other papers have been doing. We'll really want to look at the lag a little bit more closely. Obviously, with a better date, with a better construction of this fire plume, with better variation, hopefully we're able to construct a slightly longer term measure of this air pollution on the workers. Yeah, of course, we're not looking at worker output. We're just looking at how many hours they said they're going to work. So there could be some other effect happening in the firm that we are not taking into account in this paper. Yeah, just looking at how many hours they go to work rather than their actual output. So maybe a connection there would be interesting, that there's something that pollution affects how workers are. So let's say lower productivity, right, or whatever. So there could be some other input on that as well.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't have a very good answer to that, but we'll look at that. Yeah, of course, this is just a reduced form, most of the thing. We're just still work in progress. So this is a good feedback, because then we can focus on the mechanism. That's our next step, focus on more than convincing the mechanism is air pollution rather than something else. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So I think we're out of time, and let's formally end now. So thanks to our speaker. Thanks to everyone who showed up for your questions. Thanks to the speaker. It was a great talk. So I'm going to stop recording. And yeah.